Virtual gavels bang. The Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. Please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with remote committee proceedings of HRES 8, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum and will now recognize myself for opening remarks. I want to thank my good friend, the ranking member, Mr. Shabbat, the members of this subcommittee, our witnesses, and the members of the public for joining today's hearing. For almost 2 years, the COVID-19 pandemic has ravaged communities, devastated economies, and disrupted the fabric of our international global system. It's a reminder of the grave consequences that low probability, high impact biological threats can have on our daily lives if we're not prepared. Moving forward, we can do better. As chair of the subcommittee, I've convened multiple hearings related to the 2019 novel coronavirus, including the first congressional hearing on this topic in early February 2020, and on enhancing U.S. and global biosecurity. In the near 2 years since the first hearing on COVID-19, we have thankfully seen meaningful efforts in expanding investments in technologies and practices such as gene sequencing, biosurveillance, and detection. Many of these efforts have been crucial in the global fight against this pandemic thus far. For example, advances in rapid sequencing and diagnostic capabilities in South Africa allowed the government to correctly identify and report a new variant of concern to the international community in record time. New technologies also enabled partnerships between governments and pharmaceutical companies to develop, test, manufacture, and begin distribution of vaccines and therapeutics in timeframes that were previously thought impossible. Such developments do not occur overnight. They require time, dedicated staff, and resources well before an incident. As we continue to combat the coronavirus, we were reminded of the importance of making long-term investments in the global health infrastructure and taking other steps to help prevent such catastrophe in the future. That's the primary focus of today's hearing, to take stock of current resources dedicated to this critical field and to assess what more needs to be done to work with international partners to strengthen biosecurity and biosurveillance practices globally. These conversations are particularly relevant when one factors in the possibility of facing pathogens and diseases intentionally created by bad actors. Biological weapons and especially dangerous pathogens existed before COVID-19, but the threat they pose today is now undeniable. Laboratories around the world regularly handle dangerous pathogens, and these threats are only amplified by the widespread availability of new gene editing technologies such as CRISPR. It is imperative that we ensure our government has the right strategy and resources to prevent naturally occurring as well as man-made pathogens from causing the next pandemic. We cannot afford to be stagnant in our preparations and planning for the biological threats of tomorrow. The pandemic also reaffirms the need for continued U.S. global leadership for a proactive biological security and defense strategy. Prioritizing investments to counter and prepare for biological threats, ranging from research-related or medical center accidents to naturally occurring pathogens to deliberate biological weapon attacks, is a national security imperative and requires appropriate resourcing and sustained attention. Much like the counterterrorism and countering weapons of mass destruction proliferation, the field of biosecurity measures success through the absence of an incident. But as the pandemic clearly demonstrates, we must not wait for a devastating crisis to start investing in biosecurity. Particularly in today's interconnected world, a deadly pathogen unleashed in the opposite corner of the world would be upon our doorstep shortly thereafter. Therefore, we must be proactive. The international community has a collective responsibility to work together to improve biosecurity systems and regimes worldwide. We need to examine how we're making investments in deterrence and detection and ensure that we have well-resourced mechanisms to prevent and defeat both naturally occurring health challenges as well as acts of bioterrorism. I want to thank our witnesses today in advance for sharing their expertise with us as we consider this crucial matter. And with that, let me go ahead and yield 5 minutes to my good friend from Ohio, our ranking member, Representative Steve Shabbat, for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this important hearing today. I'd also like to thank our witnesses for being here and for providing us their uniquely qualified insights. It's important to be discussing the threats posed by potential new diseases as well as a new generation of bioweapons. So I commend you for doing this. This hearing comes at a pivotal time. COVID-19 has taught us, like nothing else, the devastation that can be caused by a previously unknown disease. The Chinese Communist Party hid the emergence of the disease from the world, allowing it to become a global pandemic. This shows just how crucial it is to detect and address a new disease early on. But such a contagion could easily begin somewhere that has a less malevolent government, but a weak health system. In fact, Ebola did just that. The bottom line is the world needs to be better prepared to detect and combat new diseases before they get out of control. It's possible, of course, that even deadlier diseases and viruses than COVID-19 could threaten us, as well as chemical compounds. Syria, Russia, and North Korea, for example, have used chlorine gas, Novichok, and VX nerve agent to murder dissidents and perceived enemies, both in their own countries and across the globe. To make matters worse, the Biological Weapons Convention, the international treaty banning biological weapons, lacks enforcement, while the UN's Implementation Support Unit has 3 people on staff and a budget smaller than that of a McDonald's. Further, according to the State Department, North Korea and Russia have current offensive bioweapon programs which are illegal under treaty. Turn the sound off. And China and Iran are engaging in dual-use research in violation of the treaty as well. All this is compounded by new and emerging science and technologies that have made it easier than ever before for individuals, even with a limited amount of training and knowledge, to genetically engineer new threats. Such advances, which could potentially do wonders in the fields of health and medicine, are inherently dual use and, in the hands of our adversaries, pose a threat to our national security. Unless we take this threat seriously, countries that have already violated their legal obligations not to use chemical weapons could see advances in biotechnology as offering a new range of weapons that are targeted, deniable, and incredibly lethal. COVID-19 has raised questions about the nature of this technology itself, including around the issue of gain-of-function research. As we now know, scientists have the ability to genetically manipulate and modify viruses without leaving any evidence. They can even create synthetic viruses from scratch, choosing the level of transmissibility and lethality in humans. Even before the current pandemic, groups of researchers around the world were using existing techniques to create hybrid viruses known to have pandemic potential and testing new and novel viruses. Going forward, we must balance our need to predict and detect new diseases that could cause pandemics with the potential for accidents or for the weaponization of new discoveries. Supporters argue that gain-of-function research is critical to safeguarding public health and that lab accidents are rare and isolated, but they downplay the inherent risks posed by aggressive experimentation. The level of sophistication seen in terrorist groups like the Islamic State makes it more likely, not less, that these new technologies will be exploited by terrorist organizations seeking new asymmetric weapons. There is no need to hijack an airliner when you can simply release a weaponized virus in an airport terminal. The death toll from the resulting pandemic could be in the millions. Worse, It might not even take a terrorist acting intentionally. History shows us that lab accidents are frequent. For instance, in 1979, anthrax was accidentally released from a Soviet military research facility. Despite assurances to the contrary from American and Soviet scientists, we know that this lab leak resulted in infections and the deaths of close to 100 people. Moving forward, it's clear that we need to rebalance our priorities to better prepare for such threats. Chairman Bera, I look forward to working with you as we consider how to respond to these challenges. We are facing a very real threat, one that we are not adequately addressing, I believe, at the present time. So again, I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Look forward to their testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Shabbat. Let me go ahead and briefly introduce our witnesses. First, we have Dr. Jaime Yassif, Senior Fellow for Global Biological Policy and Programs at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Dr. Yassif was previously a program officer at Open Philanthropy, where she led the Biosecurity and Pandemic Preparedness Initiative. Prior to that, she was a Science and Technology Policy Advisor at the U.S. Department of Defense, where she focused on oversight of the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program and East Asia security issues. Next, we welcome the Honorable Andy Weber, Senior Fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks, James E. Nolan Center on Strategic Weapons. Mr. Weber has had a long career of U.S. government service, including as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs from 2009 to 2014. He also coordinated U.S. leadership of the International Ebola Response for the Department of State. He serves on the boards of Healthcare Ready and the Arms Control Association, among others. Next, we have Dr. Amesh Adalja, who is the Senior Scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, an Adjunct Assistant Professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and affiliate the Johns Hopkins Center for Global Health. Among his many accomplishments and contributions, Dr. Adalja has served on U.S. government panels tasked with developing guidelines for the treatment of plague, botulism, and anthrax in mass casualty settings for the system of care for infectious disease emergencies. Last but not least, we have Dr. Kevin Esvelt, an assistant professor at the MIT Media Lab, where he leads the Sculpting Evolution Group in exploring evolutionary and ecological engineering. Professor Esvelt helped pioneer the development of CRISPR, the powerful new method of genome engineering, and is the inventor of synthetic viral ecosystems for the directed evolution of biomolecules. I want to thank all of you for participating in today's hearing, and I will now recognize witnesses for 5 minutes. Without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. I will first invite Dr. Yassif to share her testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Bera, Ranking Member Shabbat, and other members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to join today's hearing to share my perspective on biosecurity for the future. I'm a senior fellow at NTI, which is a nonpartisan global security organization focused on reducing nuclear and biological threats imperiling humanity. Over the past 21 months, COVID has revealed that national governments and the international community are unprepared to respond to pandemics, underscoring our shared vulnerability to future catastrophic biological threats that could match the impact of the current pandemic or cause damage that is much more severe. To effectively guard against these risks, the world needs a layered defense, comprised of measures for prevention, detection, and response. I will focus my testimony today primarily on actions necessary to prevent catastrophic biological events, and specifically I'll discuss 3 initiatives that NTI has been working to advance. First, I'll start with NTI's work to reduce emerging biological risks associated with rapid technology advances. Bioscience and biotechnology offer tremendous benefits. They're vital for fighting disease, protecting the environment, and promoting economic development. However, these innovations can also pose unique challenges, increasing the risks of lab accidents or deliberate misuse by malicious actors. This threat becomes increasingly pressing as the technical barriers to manipulating biological organisms continue to fall. Governments are key to safeguarding the life sciences, but they have struggled to keep pace with rapid technology advances. And at the international level, governance is also weak. There's no existing international entity dedicated as its primary mission to strengthening biosecurity and bioscience governance, notwithstanding the important work of WHO and the Biological Weapons Convention. To address this gap, NTI is working to develop the International Biosecurity and Biosafety Initiative for Science, or IBIS. We envision that this new organization will work collaboratively to strengthen global biosecurity norms and develop innovative and practical tools to uphold them. And the underlying goal would be to safeguard science and to reduce the risk of catastrophic events that could result from deliberate abuse or accidental misuse. IBIS will begin with a narrow focus on improving DNA synthesis screening practices internationally, with the understanding that its remit can expand over time. NTI is working with international partners to continue shaping the vision for IBIS, and we aspire to launch this new organization in 2022. We encourage Congress, and specifically members of this subcommittee, to support the goals of this initiative and to help us build broad international support for this effort. The second portion of my remarks will focus on our initiative for investigating high-consequence biological events of unknown origin. An effective deterrence strategy rests in part on the ability of the international community to demonstrate to would-be developers or users of bioweapons that there is a reliable system for attribution and accountability for such actions. But to do that, it will be important to bolster the capabilities of the UN system to investigate pandemic origins, whether naturally emerging, accidental, or deliberate. And this includes investing more resources in the UN Secretary General's mechanism, which has the authority to investigate alleged deliberate bioweapons misuse, or deliberate weapons use. We must also fill gaps, however, specifically in the capabilities to investigate the source of biological events of unknown origin. This important work falls at the seam between existing mechanisms, including the outbreak investigation capabilities of the World Health Organization and the UN Secretary General's mechanism. To meet this need, NTI is pursuing the establishment of a new joint assessment mechanism for investigating high-consequence bioevents of unknown origin. We envision that this mechanism would take an approach that is rapid, transparent, evidence-based, and legitimate in the eyes of the international community. I hope Congress and this subcommittee will support the establishment of this type of multilateral mechanism, which will be critical for mitigating pandemic effects in real time and for deterring future bioweapons development and use. The third initiative that I will very briefly address is financing for pandemic preparedness. Building strong systems for early detection and robust response is critical for stopping outbreaks from evolving into global pandemics, and it can also contribute to deterrence. But none of this can happen without resources. As documented by the 2021 Global Health Security Index, which we are releasing this morning, most nations have not made dedicated financial investments in pandemic preparedness. The current short-sighted approach to financing doesn't make a lot of sense because investing in pandemic preparedness is highly cost-effective. COVID has led to trillions in economic losses and extensive damage to global economies, and yet the international community can effectively guard against these risks with a global investment on the order of $1 to several $100 billion. To achieve and sustain this level of investment, we need to redesign our collective approach to financing. That's why NTI is working with partners to advocate for a new catalytic multilateral financing mechanism for pandemic preparedness in countries around the world. We applaud the leadership that the US has already signaled by championing the establishment of a new multilateral financing mechanism at the recent Global COVID-19 Summit. Now it must follow through with funding to set the bar for others and challenge them to step up and contribute. The US should contribute at least $2 billion in seed funding and work with partners to mobilize at least $10 billion annually. Such an investment would constitute a tiny fraction of the potentially catastrophic costs of inaction. To conclude, COVID has served as a warning shot, highlighting our shared vulnerability to global pandemics. While national and global leaders are understandably focused on the current crisis, they cannot afford the essential work to prevent and respond to future high-consequence bioevents. Chairman Bera, Ranking Member Shabbat, and other members of this subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. I now invite Mr. Weber for his testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Bera, Ranking Member Shabbat, and members of the committee, I'm honored to appear before you today. I would like to applaud the committee for hosting this hearing on what I believe is one of the most consequential issues for the United States and the international community: deterring biological weapons threats and preventing pandemics. I have focused on countering biological threats for the bulk of my career. In the 1990s, I worked with the Department of Defense Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program and saw firsthand the massive scale of the Soviet Union's offensive biological weapons complex. One facility we completely dismantled at the request of First President of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, was capable of producing 300 tons of anthrax agent during a mobilization period of about 8 months. Another laboratory in Koltsovo, Russia, perfected viral weapons to cause horrific diseases like smallpox, Marburg, and Ebola. Biological weapons threats are increasing due to several factors, including advanced North Korean and Russian offensive programs, China's huge investments in dual-use biotechnologies, and a revolution in biotechnology that is making it easier and cheaper for even small groups or individuals to misuse biology. The United States should now pursue a strategy based on two reinforcing goals. The first is preventing future outbreaks from ever again reaching pandemic scale. This goal is more achievable than ever, though it will take leadership and sustained investments in biodefense, the US bioeconomy, and international partnerships. The second focuses on deliberate biological threats, which are increasing. The United States should lead the world in making biological weapons the first category of weapons of mass destruction to be effectively eliminated or rendered obsolete. Deterrence is at the heart of this proposal. Specifically, we're calling for a US strategy of deterrence by denial. This type of deterrence strategy would focus on ultimately denying the attacker success in their aims regarding biological weapons. Today, US innovation has created a new paradigm. We now have the technologies and tools needed to make deterrence by denial regarding deliberate biological threats and pandemic prevention a reality. Our task today is to deploy such advanced technologies effectively and integrate them via a systems approach to addressing the full range of biological threats. We need fast and precise pathogen early warning. We need these systems to produce and share robust data that can be used for rapidly characterizing pathogens and tailoring diagnostics and countermeasures, vaccines and medical treatments to help stop them. One of the top opportunities to enhance early warning stems from the Biological Threat Reduction Program at the Department of Defense. This program, which I helped create, has long been used for advancing biosurveillance and biosecurity with many partners around the world. This paid off heavily. Several US allies and partners have been leaders in detecting and monitoring COVID-19. I deeply appreciate that this year, you in the House of Representatives, on a bipartisan basis, restored the severe and inexplicable Pentagon cuts to the Biological Threat Reduction Program. It will also be critical to revitalize and expand another Department of Defense program that has suffered budget cuts and underutilization in recent years. The Pentagon's Chemical and Biological Defense Program, or CBDP. Despite a strong track record of performance and extensive national capacities, in recent years, department leaders have slashed CBDP's budget, even during a pandemic, and restricted its ability to respond to COVID-19 early in the pandemic. I am heartened, however, that in launching the first ever Pentagon Biodefense Posture Review last month, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin commanded the Department of Defense to prioritize biodefense across the full spectrum of biological threats, from naturally occurring to accidental and deliberate biological incidents. To enact a national strategy to take biological weapons off the table as a weapon of mass destruction threat, and to prevent future infectious disease threats from growing to pandemic scale, I and my colleagues recommend an investment plan that we call 10 plus 10 over 10. This entails investing $10 billion per year for 10 years for deterring and addressing biological weapons threats, plus $10 billion per year for 10 years for global health security and direct pandemic prevention initiatives. The details of this $200 billion 10-year plan will be published in our forthcoming handbook for deterring biological weapons and preventing future pandemics. The Council on Strategic Risks will release it this month. In conclusion, the United States has made significant progress in addressing biological threats over the past several decades. The COVID-19 pandemic was a wake-up call. The good news is that it is within our reach to take biological threats off the table. To do so, we must summon the political will to set a bold strategy for the United States and our partners around the world. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. I now invite Dr. Adalja for his testimony.
Chairman and Dr. Bera, Ranking Member Shabbat, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to offer testimony today on the biosecurity for the future, strengthening deterrence and detection. I am a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. The opinions expressed herein are my own and do not reflect the views of Johns Hopkins University. As our country and the rest of the world continue to grapple with the devastating impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is appropriate and important to put surveillance systems and strategies in place to detect in the future the emergence or reemergence of dangerous viruses with pandemic potential. Because many infectious diseases are contagious and transmit between humans easily, infectious disease threats anywhere can universalize very quickly. We are now seeing firsthand that pathogens no longer travel at the speed of a steamship, they travel at the speed of a jet. Borders are porous and diseases seep through them quickly. The US needs to have as comprehensive global situational awareness of infectious disease threats as possible. As the US government decides how to best invest limited resources in early warning systems for detection of future viral threats, it is critical to prioritize surveillance activities that, one, are the most likely to uncover actual rather than hypothetical threats, and two, are practical and add value every day to preparedness, even between outbreaks. Too often, our limited surveillance dollars are funding overly broad surveillance and basic analysis that includes a vast collection of animal samples with the goal of identifying potential infectious diseases emanating from animals in spillover or zoonotic events. Given the history of viruses such as SARS-CoV-2, Nipah, Ebola, and HIV, zoonotic spillover events are an appropriate priority. However, focusing our surveillance efforts on the constant sampling of animals can be like looking for a needle in a never-ending haystack. While this type of surveillance can play a part in early warning systems, and it helps us to improve our understanding of disease in animal species, we should be careful not to place an overemphasis on viral cataloging efforts. These are indeed essential virologic and scientific tasks, but should not be construed to be synonymous with early warning or a substitute for pandemic preparedness activities. We should complement the broad sampling of animal species with a more targeted type of surveillance, focused on sampling of viruses present in patients in clinical environments. A microbe most likely to cause a pandemic or disruptive outbreak is likely one that possesses the ability to infect humans to some extent now. These are infections that are occurring in humans by pathogens that have the capacity to do so now. Such a microbe may go unnoticed, mistaken for other causes, or occur in populations where diagnostic technology is not available. It may be spread via the respiratory route and cause a respiratory infection such as pneumonia. It may also have characteristics that can cause a brain or central nervous system infection like meningitis. And critically, it is likely to result in sepsis or septic shock as the final common pathway to severe disease and death. The majority of these cases go without identification of the virus and without a specific diagnosis. The empiric treatment either works or it doesn't. This is something I witnessed in the United States, and it is very common internationally. I liken the undiagnosed syndromes to biological dark matter, which likely contain key information about what is making people sick, some deathly, today, right now, everywhere. The first COVID-19 cases in Wuhan were mixed in with influenza, and they were missed. A few weeks would have saved lives if there was early detection. The first US cases of the novel 2009 H1N1 pandemic virus was only identified because people went to a naval surveillance study site and got this virus identified much earlier. Whether what is lurking in the biological dark matter is the first human foray for an emerging pathogen, a change in behavior of a known pathogen, or an ordinary infection that went undiagnosed, it is valuable information. We need to commit and spend more time diving deep to understand this dark matter. This is a no-regret investment because it is likely to uncover actual rather than hypothetical threats. The value is fivefold. First, if it is a new emerging pathogen that is obscured because it is causing a familiar clinical syndrome, its discovery could be an early warning for the entire world. Second, if a new property has evolved in a known pathogen, it can be valuable clinical information. Third, inappropriate use of antibiotics for these undiagnosed syndromes contributes to antimicrobial resistance worldwide. Fourth, we will learn a lot about the epidemiology of what is circulating. And fifth, we will engage in global health diplomacy. I believe Congress should prioritize augmentation of diagnostic technologies as part of the international biosurveillance enterprise. These technologies exist today. It doesn't necessarily involve building a very big lab. I think it's about improving bread and butter diagnostic capacities, and I think it will help us all. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Oops. Professor Esvelt. Did we lose Professor Esvelt? Looks as though we may have lost Professor Esvelt.
Yes, stand by, sir. We're just getting him back on here.
Okay. Professor Esvelt?
Individuals.
Teresa, can you work with Professor Esvelt?
So we're seeing Dr. Esvelt on the line again. Dr. Esvelt, if you wouldn't mind starting.
Apologies, could you not hear me?
No, sir.
We couldn't hear you. We lost you for a moment there. If you want to start your 5 minutes of testimony. Teresa, we've lost him again. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Sir, if you wouldn't mind, we will work with Dr. Esvelt on his bandwidth issues. We can come back to him if that is okay with you.
Okay, that sounds fine. Why don't we, in the interest of time, we will now move on to questions, and then when Professor Esvelt gets back on, we can allow him to do his opening testimony. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purpose of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I will recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know, and we will circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. With that, looking to see if Professor Esvelt's on, and not seeing him at this moment, I will recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Weber, I applaud your optimism that we could, actually reduce the threat significantly down to zero. But I do worry about the readily available technology and the fact that high school students are learning how to use CRISPR technology, which isn't a bad thing. As a doctor, we've made remarkable achievements in the therapeutics that we have to treat oncology, cancers, and remarkable advances. But I do worry about the downside. I'm going to ask, I guess each of the witnesses. One thing that we touched on was biosurveillance and how we ought to use biosurveillance. We've invested billions of dollars into gene sequencing, which was woefully inadequate here in the United States, but also worldwide. And we're doing a much better job around COVID-19 in terms of addressing those threats. Maybe starting with Dr. Yassif, as we in Congress think about these investments, beyond COVID-19, what are the regimes in biosurveillance that we should be thinking about, both here domestically, but then also internationally, to identify as quickly as possible both naturally occurring pathogens, but also man-made pathogens?
Thank you, Chairman Bera. I appreciate that really timely and important question. Certainly, biosurveillance is critically important for part of the layered defense that we need to protect against high consequence biological risks. I'll share 3 quick points. One is that we really need to integrate gene sequencing technology, as you've mentioned, into biosurveillance systems, both domestically and internationally. I would argue that before COVID, that wasn't really in place, and I think that's still a work in progress. Second, we'll need to ensure that our biosurveillance systems and data sharing capabilities are integrated across countries and across regions. This has been a significant challenge that experts in the community have been discussing for years, and we have a long way to go to create an integrated global system. I think third I would offer is that we need to have a combination of a baseline set of data so we know what normal background biological noise looks like, and so we can detect unusual events and new pathogens that we might not have been looking for. So we can detect unknown unknowns, especially as we're looking to the future where we might have to contend with engineered pathogens. So those are some recommendations that I would offer. Thank you.
Mr. Weber, do you want to add?
Yes, I completely agree with you that these new technologies like metagenomic sequencing give us incredible capabilities to improve our biosurveillance and early warning systems, which are the key to both preventing pandemics, isolating outbreaks before they become epidemics and pandemics, but also an important part, just as we have a nuclear detection system to prevent biological terrorism, having early warning against deliberate biological threats needs to be a big part of our deterrence strategy. Our adversaries need to know that they will be detected and caught if they launch biological weapons attacks. So I think it's an exciting time, and one of the tools that the US government has is the Biological Threat Reduction Program that is implemented by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. I was involved in that for decades, and one of the goals was to enhance global biosurveillance, working with partners all around the world. And I think in the next phase, with sufficient funding from Congress, it's a shame that the department cut over $100 million from this program in the current year FY22 budget request. But if we can restore that funding, we can use those dollars to surge technologies that will enable genomic sequencing to be used broadly as part of our early warning system against pandemics and bioattacks. So the opportunity is really incredible. Also, metagenomic sequencing gives us new opportunities to identify unknown pathogens. We don't have to just test for a list of 10 or 12 specific pathogens, but we can take a sample and test it for everything, virtually hundreds of potential pathogens. And it's getting much cheaper and faster to do this. So I agree, we need to, both domestically and abroad, deploy these new capabilities on a massive scale.
Great, wonderful. I see I'm out of time. I do see Professor Esvelt on. Professor, do you want to give your testimony, and then we'll come back to the ranking member, Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Chairman Bera. Ranking Member Shabbat, members of the subcommittee. First, I'm going to check. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Thank you for inviting me here today, and additional thanks to my fellow witnesses for outlining the situation. As a practicing biotechnologist, I am deeply concerned that pandemic viruses pose a proliferation threat greater than that of nuclear weapons. The US government can take specific steps that would greatly reduce this risk. The threat is severe because new technologies have given thousands of skilled individuals the ability to assemble infectious viruses using materials and equipment that can be ordered online. If scientists learn and share which viruses could cause new pandemics, no matter how pure our motives, everyone with these skills will gain access to credible weapons of mass destruction. For example, even though there are no virologists in my own lab at MIT, perhaps a third of us could order synthetic DNA in the mail and successfully follow published step-by-step virus assembly protocols. Thankfully, scientists don't yet know of any animal or lab-created viruses that would cause another pandemic. But some well-meaning programs that aim to prevent or mitigate natural pandemics are trying to identify all of the viruses that could cause them and publish a list of the most threatening ones. This inadvertently threatens US national security and the world's future. I do not believe that there are remotely commensurate benefits. The vast majority of pandemic viruses would never naturally jump into humans, and finding the remainder would not speed vaccine development. The main proliferation risk comes from laboratory experiments performed by EcoHealth Alliance and similar programs to determine which viruses would likely cause pandemics. These experiments are the equivalent of nuclear tests. They first received federal support back when it was much harder to make viruses, and funding has continued under administrations of both parties. Nations from the Netherlands to China to Germany have also funded these kinds of experiments. In my opinion, they should be stopped, not just in China and in the US, but everywhere. If successful, pandemic virus prediction will give thousands of actors the ability to ignite more pandemics at the same time than would normally occur in a century. If there is published peer-reviewed research describing the potential of these viral weapons, threats to use them will be all too credible. Imagine a rogue state warning that infectious samples of all the top-ranked pandemic viruses will be released in airports if their regime is overthrown. Extremist groups, apocalyptic cults, or even a lone wolf bioterrorist could kill more people than any nuclear weapon. So what can be done to minimize our vulnerability to pandemic proliferation? First, Congress should issue a finding that pandemic virus prediction threatens the security of the United States. That alone would change the tenor of the discussion and lead federal agencies with little security expertise to rethink their support and oversight of such experiments, which are only performed by a tiny fraction of virology labs. Second, the US and other governments should limit access to synthetic viral DNA. The California state legislature recently passed well-targeted legislation with this intent, but it was vetoed on the grounds that security bills should be enacted federally. Third, the US could work with China on these issues because this is one case where our interests are aligned. Both nations have little to gain and much to lose if pandemic viruses become widely accessible. Any diplomatic benefits or leverage that we gain here could be applied to more sensitive challenges. Fourth, as the other witnesses have emphasized, we should invest in detecting biological threats early. A sequencing-based nucleic acid observatory focused on travel hubs such as airports could reliably detect any emerging biological threat. And it could be done using current technology, we believe, for less than $1 billion a year. This would improve our response time to all pandemics and deter attacks. Last, Congress could amend the Bioterrorism Act of 2002 to regulate all viruses with evidence suggestive of pandemic potential through the Federal Select Agent Program, which applies to all research, as well as export controls. If we act now, we can greatly reduce the chance that viruses will be used as weapons. Pandemic virus prediction is a needless game of Russian roulette, and we keep adding more ammunition. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me now recognize my good friend, the ranking member, gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you for holding this, what I think is a very, very important meeting. And I want to commend all of the witnesses for their testimony this morning. Dr. Esvelt, I'm going to turn to you if I can. Since the beginning of this pandemic, I think to a considerable degree, the American public has been misinformed, kind of misled, first of all, obviously by the PRC, but to some degree, the coverage in the media as far as the relative likelihood that a lab leak actually caused this pandemic. So I have a few questions. First of all, it's my understanding that lab leaks, even in this country, but especially in other parts of across the globe, are pretty safe, but that lab leaks do happen. In fact, much more often than the general public or the media seem to appreciate. Could you comment on that? And how frequently do such lab leaks actually occur?
That is an excellent question, Ranking Member Shabbat. There is well-documented evidence that hundreds of lab leaks involving dangerous pathogens occur around the world. This evidence is so substantial. Of course, most of them do not involve potential pandemic viruses, but nevertheless, we know that the risk is non-trivial. To the extent that we add one more to the list, whether or not we can do so doesn't change our assessment of the risk, which is that it is definitely non-trivial. I'm not saying that some of these experiments cannot be performed safely in theory, but in practice, we are all human, and humans do make mistakes.
Thank you. Let me ask you specifically this. How many times, for example, was there a SARS leak in the PRC, in a lab in China?
There were two known occasions, at least two known occasions confirmed, of leaks of SARS-1 after the initial outbreak. One of them actually did lead to a chain of transmission through people associated with the laboratory members that experienced the leak.
Thank you. And I think much of the world, unfortunately, is woefully behind in getting their healthcare systems up to the standards that are set by the international health regulations, and that's why I've been working very closely with my Democratic colleague Jerry Connolly on the Global Health Security Act. We've been working on that now for a number of years, and I would want to add that it was somewhat prescient, and I want to say particularly on Mr. Connolly's part, because we introduced this prior to COVID. It was almost a year prior to COVID that we introduced this legislation, and then the COVID came around, was facing us around the corner. Could you talk about right now, even, if our standards are very good here in the United States, if they're not up to par in other countries across the globe, how it can affect us here at home? And obviously, COVID is the best example, but why should we care? Why should we, for example, we give assistance across the globe with oftentimes a recommendation of how that assistance or requirements of how that assistance is utilized. How do things across the globe, how can they affect us here at home? Why should we care about that?
Well, unfortunately, a leak of a pandemic-capable virus anywhere in the world will most certainly come to affect us here in the United States, unless it can be contained elsewhere. And as noted, many countries have much less sophisticated systems for detection and containment. It's also certainly true that even in the United States, in well-regarded labs, leaks do happen. So the risk is not zero anywhere in the world, and it is arguably more severe elsewhere, for certain. So I don't mean to say that we should not support other countries in monitoring the animal-human interface, as Dr. Adalja suggested, and in assisting them in detecting threats as early as possible and containing them before they get to American shores. But supporting other nations in directly culturing these kinds of viruses in the lab does risk lab leaks. What's more, if we identify a pandemic-capable virus anywhere in the world and we publish it, then a malevolent actor anywhere in the world could assemble it using available published protocols and deliberately release it as a weapon of mass destruction. So that kind of research, pandemic virus prediction, simply cannot be performed safely anywhere in the world.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Mr. Chair, my time has expired. I yield back.
Great, thank you. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank our witnesses. I'm glad that Dr. Esvelt made it back. I had a question for him, and I know he's an expert on this, and if we didn't know it from his resume, we could tell it from the whiteboard behind him. It's very impressive. We've talked a lot about what happens in the lab, but I'd like to extend that and talk about the relationship between biosecurity and climate change. Climate change leads to demographic changes, people move, animals move, the weather changes, patterns that affect growth of crops. All of those things seem to be related in some way to biosecurity. And I wonder if you could address that relationship and how we might look at this bigger picture, not just the labs.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So the idea you've so well articulated is often called One Health, And the idea is that the health of animals and the environment and people is all connected. Most obviously because viruses and other pathogens can spread between animals and people. And as we've seen with SARS-2, that can even occur back and possibly back and forth. We're not certain. So monitoring the health of the environment and animals and detecting animal outbreaks could potentially allow us to anticipate threats to humans. Whether the risk of natural pandemics resulting from spillover from animals to humans is greater now than before has been advanced as a hypothesis. There isn't a lot of data to support that one way or another. To the extent that we're forcing wild animals into contact with humans as we advance into the environment, that should increase the risk. On the other hand, more people now live in cities than before, which might imply fewer people in direct contact with those animals. But it is certainly true that the impacts on the environment can come back to affect our health in direct ways. So I fully support the sorts of monitoring programs that examine the animal-human interface, as those really could detect nascent pandemics before they actually spread out of control. That is very distinct from surveying for animal viruses, the vast majority of which will never actually come in contact with humans, but if identified, could be deliberately assembled and released as a weapon.
Well, thank you for that answer. It kind of confirms what I just suspected on an informal level, and I'd like it if we could look into that, Mr. Chairman, see if there's some way we can be supportive of that kind of research. Thank you, Doctor. I would ask Dr. Yassif, we've had different responses to the COVID. Different states have different degrees of prevention or cure. Different countries have come on earlier, later. Do you think it's better for us to have universal standards that everybody follows so we're all on the same page? Or is it better to respond individually as with circumstances that differ, how we can meet those as opposed to being bound by one set of rules?
Well, thank you so much for that really important and timely question. I think the challenge of finding a way for every country to lead its own pandemic response and mitigation efforts while having an integrated global response is not trivial, but it's important to get it right. I think the short answer is it's sort of a balance between the two sort of poles that you're talking about. One is having a shared global standard while still allowing countries the flexibility to respond as appropriate based on their needs and capabilities. And I think that this got a few pieces. So first, I think at the international level, what we really need is a more integrated and effective early warning system associated with the WHO sort of alert and warning system, the Public Health Emergency of International Concern Declaration. That needs to be strengthened. And we at NTI have recommended that it shift from a binary sort of yes/no signal to something that's more that has multiple grades. So it provides information to countries about how bad an emerging pandemic risk might be. So we just need to strengthen that system so countries have better sense of what the risk is over the horizon, even perhaps before it might have materialized. And I think to make that real, you can think about the early stages of COVID, perhaps in February and March of 2020, when we saw it start to break out in certain parts of the world, but we weren't really sure how serious it was. And we need to really do better in terms of early intelligence, epidemic intelligence, and sort of thinking about the emerging risks of a new pandemic. Second, I would offer is that countries, I think the shared approach that countries should offer is a proactive response that's triggered early response to emerging pandemics, not wait for mounting case counts and fatalities, because then it's too late. But fundamentally, countries around the world have different populations and different capabilities, and so they'll have to have flexibility within that system to respond effectively. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Hi, all, and thank you so much for the conversation. It's been riveting and terrifying all at the same time. And I've been trying to compose my questions, and I have so many of them, and no real good way to articulate them into one cogent question. Dr. Esvelt, I think your testimony was perhaps the most devastating. And so at the same time, I hear optimism coming that we will be able to manage and control future pandemics. But I'm concerned and confused where the advice is, basically not to make it too exaggerated, but we should stick our heads in the collective sand and not look up or around because of the implications that bad actors, would have if we were to be able to understand what the threats are. So I also look at the response that the nation took and the world has taken to COVID-19, and this has something to do with Representative Titus's line of questions, which is we've done horribly as a collective in terms of managing what happened with COVID-19. And even had we had advanced warning and a couple weeks of warning, I'm not certain that we would end up in much of a different place than we are. And so here we are, optimism coming from you all and advice to not look around. But we really have mismanaged this one. How can we possibly do this better? And what is your prescription for the average person, citizen, to be able to prevent this from happening and for it to, I'm just trying to figure out, what do we do to prevent another pandemic from happening if we're not going to look around and understand what it is, if we're not going to develop cures or techniques to address those issues, and if we've got a population that is uncompliant. And I would love to turn that over to my fellow MIT person, Dr. Esvelt.
Thank you for that very difficult question. So I think to be blunt, we are in a very bad place. And even with very substantial investments, we will still struggle against a truly nasty pandemic. In my assessment, something deliberate could be much worse than anything that is natural, simply because something that is natural is a single point of spillover and involves a single virus, whereas something deliberate could be multiple points in travel hubs with multiple viruses. So that is why I say deliberate would be worse. Also, engineered would be worse, but that is something that I really would prefer that we not discuss today. If we want to be actually immune to future pandemics, as the Honorable Andy Weber has indicated, I think we need early warning metagenomic sequencing systems, especially in travel hubs, so we know what it is. Once we know what it is, then we can figure out where it is with diagnostics. But then we need to ensure that food distribution, water distribution, and power all stay on, healthcare remains operational in the teeth of a 30% plus lethality pandemic. And I think that can only be done by investing in new personal protective equipment, make it comfortable, as good as a powered air purifying respirator today, and it needs to be reliable enough that all essential workers can be confident going out there in that kind of a pandemic and keeping our civilization intact. If we do that, then I think we will be resistant to just about any kind of pandemic. I am not confident in our ability to reliably come up with vaccines or any kind of countermeasure against every kind of threat. Note that we still don't have an HIV vaccine. Note how long it took us to get Paxlovid, although I would love to see that approved immediately. These things are amazing when you can get them, but we should not assume they are possible. Whereas gear that can prevent Americans from getting infected in the first place, that will always work. And I'm not saying stick our heads in the sand on this. I'm saying build a network to ensure that whatever it is, we can see it when it comes, but that the vast majority of pandemic capable viruses out there, whether they're in nature or whether they don't exist yet and scientists are trying to evolve them, the vast majority of those would never hit us anyway. Even if we had advanced warning of a particular one, mRNA vaccine design can be done in a day now. So if we can get a virus, we're going to have it almost immediately. And so advanced knowledge of a particular virus out there that is going to come and bite us actually doesn't save us any time, as long as we're willing to combine phase 1 and phase 2 trials, which I would like to think we would certainly do in a pandemic. So that's why I say I don't think knowing a particular virus as a threat is going to help us respond. And I also don't think we're really going to invest the kind of money needed to develop vaccines for what are probably hundreds of existing pandemic capable viruses out there in nature. That just doesn't seem practical to me. So I would prefer to work on preparedness plans that would work for everything across the board.
And so these detection systems that you're talking about that are at airports, et cetera, I'm assuming that these are some sort of passive detection systems, that they don't require anybody participating in them in any way, shape, or form. And help me understand as a layperson, how in a passive detection system where you don't have a cataloging of what it is that you're looking for, do you even know that you've seen something? if that makes any sense.
That's a great question. And briefly, the answer is any serious biological threat must be growing exponentially. So if we sequence all of the nucleic acids out there, all of the RNA and DNA, because viruses can come in either form, and we just look for the sequence fragments that are growing rapidly in abundance, that is a biological threat. And every biological threat will display that signature. And we think that by looking for it, we can reliably find anything of that variety. So that's when I say, even if an adversary designs something to be undetectable by targeted probes, looking for the kinds of viruses we know are threats, we'll still be able to detect it using metagenomic sequencing in that way.
Thank you, Doctor. Is my time out?
The gentlelady's time's expired, so
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
let me go ahead and recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chair Bera, for holding this important hearing. My first question goes to Dr. Adalja. I saw that in your biography, you previously worked on the anthrax issue. I note that I was vaccinated for anthrax when I served on active duty in the military. I served overseas. And my question to you is about vaccines. Would you agree with me that vaccines are one of the best ways to mitigate pandemics?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Yes, I think when it comes to any infectious disease, prevention is always better than treatment, especially if you have a safe and effective vaccine. So vaccines have to be a cornerstone of our medical countermeasure policy, because that's what takes a threat off the table. That's what reduces severity from illness. And that ultimately is what we have to aim for by looking at what's out there in the threatscape that we know can cause infection and starting to work towards vaccines, even if it may not be the exact vaccines that's used during an epidemic or a pandemic. Making those steps down the road will get us much faster response. The work that people did on the first SARS and Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, made it much easier to develop a vaccine for SARS-CoV-2 because they already knew, for example, that the spike protein was an important target for immunity. So yes, vaccines are always going to be one of the cornerstones for medical countermeasures.
And it also turns out that our immune system is pretty smart. So when we put vaccines in and train our immune system, even when there are variants, our immune system still sort of figures it out that, oh, maybe this is something we need to take care of. So while the vaccines may not be 100% effective, they're still somewhat effective in making the immune system better against even variants. Isn't that correct?
Right. If you have an effective vaccine, it's very hard for a variant or a mutation to erase all the protection a vaccine gives you. Vaccines are not all or none. It's not an on or off switch. It's a spectrum of protection. So even if a vaccine may allow you to get infected, other arms of the immune system, other than the antibodies, may protect you against the severe consequences. So even when you have a vaccine that's not 100%, that's not a magic bug zapper, you still get benefits from them, and they are beneficial. This underscores what we do with the influenza vaccine every year. We know it's much more protective against severe disease than it is protection against mild disease, and that's also true for the COVID-19 vaccines.
Thank you. Questions for Dr. Esvelt. You said something interesting about combining phase 1 and phase 2 trials. Can you explain the difference between phase 1 and phase 2 trials for vaccine development?
Thank you, Representative. Yes, a phase 1 trial normally seeks to establish the safe dosage and doesn't try to figure out whether or not a vaccine actually is effective against a given pathogen. Phase 2 is when we give it to enough people, some of whom we know will become infected, that we will be able to tell how effective the vaccine actually is. So when I suggest combining phase 1 and phase 2, if there is a pandemic that is very high lethality, much higher than SARS-2, then in all likelihood, we would want to get shots into arms sooner rather than later, if necessary, trying multiple different doses of the same vaccine in different cohorts. Honestly, if we're serious about it, we would actually run challenge trials in which we take volunteer cohorts, guarantee them the best medical care, and deliberately infect them, some of whom would have been vaccinated with different vaccines in different amounts.
In a high lethality pandemic, would the FDA have the authority to do this, or there needs to be a change to a law for them to combine the trials and speed things up?
That is an excellent question. I'm afraid I do not know. I suspect Dr. Adalja may know.
Does anyone on the panel know?
If I could answer, I do think that this is something that that's in the Public Health Authority laws of the FDA. I don't know that for sure, but I do think there has been a lot of discussion about running phase 1 and phase 2 simultaneously. And I think there's not any obstacle to doing so. And it would be necessary during a pandemic to get a vaccine as quickly as possible to meet these 100-day goals that we hear talked about.
Thank you. And now let me speak to my Republican colleagues across the aisle. We need your help to counter vaccine disinformation. As you've just heard, vaccines are one of the most effective ways to mitigate a pandemic. And yet we have lots of folks believing that these vaccines have microchips in them, or that they cause autism, or that they're going to give you COVID or other crazy things. And all of that is false. And so we simply need Republican colleagues to step up. And when they go on Fox News, just push back on the hosts who are saying crazy stuff about these vaccines, because that's how we can beat this pandemic, by getting as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible. With that, I yield back.
Great, thank you. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Vanberger, for 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses today, thank you so much for being here. This has been extraordinarily interesting, frightening, but I believe the way that we prepare ourselves for the threats that exist is by facing them head on. So I truly appreciate your honest assessments and the information you shared. I also am thankful that the chair and the ranking member included the term deterrence in the title of today's hearing, because, frankly, the best defense against future bio threats is our ability to quickly mitigate the spread of them and the effects of any biological agent. And a critical part of any biosecurity deterrence strategy is to ensure that the United States has the manufacturing capacity to quickly ramp up our production of necessary medical countermeasures in the event of an emergency. And I'm sure all of our witnesses know active pharmaceutical ingredients are the base ingredients for producing essential generic medicines, but unfortunately, 87% of the facilities that produce APIs are overseas. Our healthcare system suffers routine shortages, even outside of emergencies, and our reliance on foreign suppliers really jeopardizes our ability to keep Americans healthy. For example, the US has lost the capacity to produce penicillin here at home. That should be kind of a flashing warning sign to those who are focused on how prepared we may be into the future. To ultimately deter or respond to future biosecurity threats or even supply chain challenges. I introduced a bill called the Prepare Act. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation to identify the essential generic medicines that are necessary for us to have as a nation available at all times, and to authorize the creation of a stockpile of active pharmaceutical ingredients so that we can ensure that our pharmaceutical supply chain is always able to produce the essential medicines that we need in the event of an emergency. Certainly my district in Central Virginia is leading the way in ensuring robust domestic supply of essential medicines, which is why I'm so focused on this issue. The Bipartisan Prepare Act would provide statutory authorization for this important federal effort and would create thousands of well-paid jobs, improve patients' access to medicines, and bolster our national biosecurity. And all of this kind of preface leads me to my question, either for Mr. Weber or for Dr. Adalja. How does strengthening the domestic production capacity of essential medicines and other medical countermeasures improve our nation's ability to deter biosecurity threats? Again, assuming you agree with that assertion, if you could comment on that.
Yes. Thank you for your leadership in this area. It's very important, and I'll just give you one example. Smallpox. We vaccinate our forces against smallpox. We have a stockpile of enough for every American in our strategic national stockpile. And I think just that fact is deterrence. It tells our adversaries that smallpox would not be successful as a weapon against the United States and its citizens. So that kind of preparedness, deterrence by having those capacities to respond, I think are key, and onshoring those capabilities here in the United States to surge and rapidly manufacture all of these medical countermeasures is vital to not just public health, but to U.S. national security.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. Dr. Adalja, would you add anything to that?
I completely agree. I liken medical countermeasures to almost an anti-ballistic missile defense system, that the more prepared we are for these threats, natural or deliberate, the less likely they are to be used. And I think the smallpox example is a great one. And I think, and I applaud your leadership on the Prepare Act, because I've worked on this issue in the past where we know that there are many active pharmaceutical ingredients that all trace back to one place. And if there is a supply chain disruption, it becomes really disastrous. And I think we need a lot more redundancy when it comes to certain medical countermeasures that should be thought of as part of national security.
So, Dr. Adalja, just following up briefly on that point, the World Health Organization maintains the list of essential medicines since I guess at least 2007, but only in 2020 did FDA publish its first list of essential medicines. As new pathogens and biothreats emerge, how can the government identify the essential medicines and medical countermeasures for the threats that exist that we as a nation will want to have to protect our people and our service members?
They'll have to have a lot of clinical read into what's actually effective, what drugs are being used, which ones are in trials, which ones are promising but not yet approved. All of those should be on the radar of people that are trying to figure out how to augment the strategic national stockpile and how to think about what needs to have redundancy in supply chains.
Excellent. Mr. Chairman, I yield back again to our witnesses. Thank you so much for your time today. It's extraordinarily helpful as we think about what Congress's role should be in making sure we're protecting our people.
Great, thank you. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Manning, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today on this important topic. Mr. Weber, I'm interested in what you started talking about at the beginning of your testimony about the strategy of deterrence of denial. And I'm wondering what exactly that would have meant. How could it have been used to prevent COVID from becoming international? What systems did we not have in place and why?
Well, we didn't have a system of early warning, rapid detection, a global system. This pandemic could have been stopped in its tracks in China if they had had a robust system of early warning. And then the other part is rapid diagnostics, testing, and contact tracing, and then countermeasures like programmable platforms like the mRNA vaccine. If we could have had that not in 10 months, but in 100 days or even less, that would give us tools to respond to any biological threat, whether it's engineered as a biological weapon or naturally occurring. So it's that system. It's all about time to detect, to know there's a problem, and then to isolate it and have those rapid countermeasures available so we can prevent them from spreading from the source to different places around the world.
So would that have required cooperation or first steps by the Chinese, or could we have had people in place who could have instigated that kind of a deterrence by denial system?
Well, the deterrence by denial strategy that I laid out is primarily to prevent the deliberate use of biological weapons against the United States, its partners, and its allies around the world. Pandemic prevention is a subset of that, I believe. And yes, we could have had in place a system of information sharing and metagenomic testing that would have given the Chinese a better capability and prepared us better for a possible spread to this country. But we didn't have.
I'm sorry, we didn't have.
We didn't have those systems in place, and it's going to require a sustained investment. I don't want to say this is going to be easy.
Okay. All right, thank you. Mr. Adalja, I appreciated your answer to Mr. Liu that vaccines are a critically important first line of defense against a pandemic, and I certainly echo Mr. Liu's comments to our colleagues, because we've seen an almost unimaginable level of vaccine hesitancy and an anti-vax movement that has dramatically harmed our effort to prevent the spread of COVID. I'd like your thoughts, Dr. Adalja, about what steps we could take to get ahead of this problem the next time around? And by this problem, I mean vaccine hesitancy or an anti-vax movement. How can we develop our population in a way that people are not just willing, but anxious to get vaccinated to prevent the spread of a future pandemic?
Thank you for that question. I think this is one of the most important aspects of the pandemic that we have to think about and reflect on to get us prepared for the next pandemic, because vaccine hesitancy is a major threat. No one imagined that we would, in the United States, still be facing the onslaught of this pandemic, not because we didn't have a vaccine, but because people chose not to take the vaccine. And I think that this self-inflicted wound is really something that's going to make us all think about how we make ourselves more resilient, even if we have these great tools, if no one wants to utilize them. So I think that we as a medical community, and I'm an infectious disease physician, have to be very proactive. The vaccine hesitancy movement has been something that has been coming at us for some time, basically since the dawn of vaccines, but with measles, mumps, rubella, with Gardasil, they continually meet each new vaccine with misinformation. And I think we have to really call it out as something that takes lives, and we can't be passive and try and debunk them only after they bring these things up. We have to have a toolkit to talk to people, to train physicians, train healthcare providers to be able to almost vaccinate people against the anti-vaccine movement by showing them how to think about this data and allowing them to really actually just open their eyes and see the benefits of vaccines. The fact that decades have been added to all of our lives because of vaccines, hundreds of thousands of lives saved. And to me, it's mind-boggling and it's frustrating. It is almost as if it's the voice of the dark ages that has gained access to internet technology and has allowed itself to spread so much bad information out there. But this is I don't think it's going to be one single solution. It really has to be the whole healthcare community, the whole medical community, scientific community, as well as policymakers that call this out for how dangerous it is and take the fight to them instead of being merely reactive.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Great, thank you. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, for 5 minutes of question.
I thank the chair very much, and I thank our witnesses for their time today. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused immense suffering, and we grieve the millions of victims who have lost their lives. As we continue to combat COVID-19, we must acknowledge that right from the outset of this devastating crisis, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, suppressed, misrepresented, and falsified information necessary to prevent a pandemic in clear violation of the international health regulations. Holding the CCP accountable is the only way to deter the release of another deadly virus on the global community in the future and ensure that the Communist Party stops violating international laws. That is why I introduced the Compensation for Americans Act, which will establish a compensation fund for those affected and allow the president to freeze Chinese assets to bring the Communist Party to the negotiating table and give the United States a comprehensive toolbox of punitive measures to further incentivize China's cooperation. However, the United States must also lead efforts to reform the international organizations and laws governing pandemic prevention and response to ensure there are real consequences for putting all nations at risk of a deadly outbreak. The United States alone cannot prevent the next pandemic. Every member of the international community must honor their legal obligations to defend against emerging bio threats. And the World Health Organization's failure to combat China's coronavirus-related misinformation campaign in the early days of the pandemic cost the international community precious time it needed to avert a crisis. And the WHO remains a deeply flawed institution and is highly susceptible to China's malign influence. Assistant Secretary Weber, what reforms to the WHO are needed to prevent authoritarian states like China from co-opting global health policy to serve their interests? What leverage, I'd say, does the United States have to secure these badly needed reforms?
Well, I think the first thing that was unfortunate was Several years ago, we pulled out of the WHO and lost our influence there. It's great that the United States is back at the table and using our influence, but we need to strengthen the international health regulations. We need to support this new pandemic treaty initiative that will close some of the gaps that exist in the IHRs. And we need to make this a priority, but it should be in the interests of all nations to work together against what is clearly a global and increasing threat of pandemics and biological weapons. And I think it's very important that this hearing is being held by the House Foreign Affairs Committee, because it is a global problem and there is no single nation solution to it. We have to work with partners around the world, even difficult partners, if we're going to get ahead of this problem.
Dr. Esvelt, the State Department's 2021 arms control report states that the People's Republic of China has been, quote, engaged in activities with dual use applications, and that the U.S. does not have sufficient information to determine whether China eliminated its biological weapons program. Can you tell me what type of dual use activities are scientists in the PRC engaged in? And do you believe the PRC is complying with its obligations under the Biological Weapons Convention? Dr. Esvelt.
Thank you for the questions. The scientists in China, like those elsewhere in the world, have definitely been attempting to identify pandemic-capable pathogens. They have additionally, in pursuit of that goal, been exploring whether combinations of potentially risky viruses are more infectious and more transmissible than the natural wild versions. Whether that is a violation of the Biological Weapons Convention is very much a legal and international question. If it is, then many nations would need to change their behavior on this. But whether or not it is true, pandemic virus prediction definitely contributes to proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and undermines our national security.
I'm very concerned about these dual use applications. My time has expired. I'd like to explore this further, and I thank the chairman for this very important hearing. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take Chairman's prerogative if I can and ask an additional question. And I'm told Mr. Levin may be joining us shortly. We talked a little bit about countermeasures as one of our best strategies for deterrence. I think it is quite remarkable that we were able to come up with a vaccine within 10 months' time. I've heard several of you suggest that if we can narrow that down to 100 days, that would, obviously the shortest possible time. My sense is with the mRNA technology, we can achieve that 100-day goal. Is that the right target at this point that we should be thinking about? Maybe Dr. Adalja or any of the witnesses?
Thanks for that question. I think 100 days is what's been articulated, and I think that is something to aim for. Whether it's 100 days or 180 days or 150 days, I think doesn't matter so much. The point is that we have the technology to speed vaccine development, and even just a week faster would have saved lives in the United States, for example, if the Pfizer vaccine was available a week later. So we do have to be much more innovative, harnessing these vaccine technologies, trying to run trials at the same time. But we also have to be cognizant of the fact that the vaccine hesitancy movement is going to say this happened even faster, and that may end up becoming a problem. But I do think that it's not a scientific problem now to get vaccines faster. And I think we have to really incentivize companies to move quickly and rapidly characterize these threats and develop vaccines. And I think it can be done.
So that's both the scientific component of it might be the easiest component. Looking at the regulatory process of having phase 1 and phase 2 trials ready to go in a pandemic, and then obviously the faster they are, obviously how we market those vaccines and address the hesitancy. I've got one last question, then I'll turn it back over to Mr. Levin and recognize Mr. Levin. We've also talked about surveillance a little bit. Something I've explored and talked to some of our technology companies is how we use technology, search terms, et cetera, as a form of surveillance. And I'd be curious if any of the experts that we have on as witnesses, have any thoughts on that? You know, if all of a sudden in a certain area, people are searching fever or searching particular search terms, is that an area that we should explore in terms of biosurveillance and how we work with the tech sector? Maybe Dr. Yassif.
Thank you, Chairman Bera. I really appreciate that question. I do think that we need to think creatively about using all the different and emerging new technologies that are at our disposal to take creative approaches to biosurveillance. So the kind of Google search and based strategy that you're describing is something that Google and others have tried to do in the past. I think with some success, but in some ways mixed results. But I think over time we're seeing more and more different types of data streams come online that we could think about integrating into a 21st century strategy for biosurveillance. And I think that could be really useful for early detection of emerging infectious disease outbreaks so that we can stop outbreaks at the source, which is critical, as the other witnesses have shared. And it may also perhaps yield other types of information that could help us more reliably attribute the source of outbreaks in the event that we're not sure if they were natural or not. And we're thinking about that in the context of our joint assessment mechanism that I discussed in my testimony. And if I may, I just wanted to offer one more thought about the role of vaccines and other capabilities for ensuring that the United States and the globe can respond effectively to pandemics. And I absolutely agree with all the comments that have been made about the critical importance of vaccines and the critical importance of platform technologies, and that the most robust thing we can do is to be prepared to be surprised, and that we shouldn't assume that we will know in advance where the next pandemic threat will emerge from, and we absolutely need to have a flexible and adaptable response, and it has to be quick. I could not agree more. But I would also offer that we need non-pharmaceutical interventions in the interim. So when we saw with COVID, it took us well over a year and actually quite a lot longer to have a vaccine that was developed, tested, and ready to go. And we should absolutely accelerate those timelines. I think that's a high priority. But we need to acknowledge that there's going to be a lag time. And in that interim, the virus will spread and lives will be lost and economies will be damaged. And social distancing and non-pharmaceutical interventions can be incredibly valuable for slowing the chains of transmission and saving lives during a public health emergency of international concern. And we shouldn't be winging it during a pandemic. We should have plans in place. We should have national governments around the world should have response plans in place for high consequence biological events where you are triggering proactive early response that incorporates these kinds of provisions for national and global response, in addition to all the other important medical countermeasures and other provisions that we've been discussing. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much, Chairman Bera, for holding this really important hearing and for your leadership on these issues. I want to talk about arms control and its relationship with bio threats. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic has made the importance of international cooperation in the face of emerging bio threats abundantly clear. And it appears that all the witnesses before the subcommittee today would agree that we have to improve international cooperation among national governments and international organizations on biosecurity issues if we hope to prevent more severe threats in the future. Despite the US and Russia being in communication on arms control, which is certainly an improvement from the last 4 years, it's my sense that real progress towards another major arms control agreement is stalled. So I'm curious whether you think that investing in international cooperation and negotiations with other governments on biosecurity would also yield benefits for broader arms control efforts. For instance, could the US leverage cooperation on biosecurity as we seek to address the arsenals of other nuclear powers? Now, Mr. Weber, you stated in your testimony that we could more effectively deter the use of bioweapons if US policy were explicitly to state that US nuclear weapons' sole purpose was to deter the use of nuclear weapons. Why is the threat of nuclear use not credible in deterring biological attacks? Could you explain that?
Yes, and I certainly support what candidate Biden said, that we should adopt a sole purpose strategy that nuclear weapons are for deterring nuclear weapons. Traditionally, we've included bio threats, big cyber threats, chemical threats as something that we think that nuclear weapons are useful in deterring. But the truth is, they're just not credible. No nation thinks that we would actually use nuclear weapons in response to a biological attack. They're not credible. And that's why we're favoring a deterrence by denial strategy. By having such good early warning and defenses against infectious disease, after all, biological weapons are infectious disease, that our adversaries will decide that it's not worth pursuing biological weapons because they won't be very effective. So that's the approach that we're recommending, is investing in our biodefenses to make these threats obsolete as weapons of mass destruction. And we also need to support the efforts to strengthen the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, which bans biological weapons. These activities that are happening in North Korea and Russia are already prohibited by the international community, and we need to work harder to find mechanisms to strengthen that international convention against the development and stockpiling of biological weapons.
All right, well, thanks. And hopefully we can, in tandem improve our, cooperation on biological weapons with a revamped effort on arms control in terms of nuclear weapons. Now, COVID-19 has proved that we can't prevent future pandemics alone. It's just blown up the idea of a go-alone strategy on foreign policy generally. And that expanding health capabilities around the globe requires sharing financial resources and making strategic investments. I understand that Dr. Yassif in her testimony has recommended that the United States invest in a new multilateral financing mechanism for pandemic preparedness that would incentivize other governments to invest in their own readiness to respond to future pandemics. And you were just touching on this. So Dr. Yassif, how can we ensure that U.S. investments in international pandemic preparedness efforts are targeted effectively?
Well, thank you, Representative. The issue of financing is absolutely critically important, and thank you for raising the multilateral pandemic preparedness financing mechanism that we've been advocating for. And I would also thank the House for being so proactive and forward-leaning on this issue. We're hoping that Congress can really advance this important initiative and get it across the finish line, understanding that it's currently the matter of active discussion. And we are advocating for this financing mechanism because everything we've had in place so far hasn't worked. We've seen a cycle of panic and neglect in the run-up to COVID that has led us woefully unprepared and has really led the U.S. and the globe, I think, to inadequately respond. And so we need a better approach. We don't think the United States can or should do it alone. We absolutely think other governments should step up and put their money on the table and contribute to their own pandemic preparedness. But absolutely, it should be targeted, and it shouldn't just be based on the fashion of the day. We should move money to the places where it's most needed and where it can have the greatest impact in reducing global biological risks. There are a number of tools at our disposal to figure out what that is. I will share that today, NTI, in partnership with the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, we released the 2021 Global Health Security Index, which has a lot of data about pandemic preparedness and biosecurity capabilities in countries around the world, including gaps and where there's room for improvement. We put that forward as a tool to help funders within government and in the private sector to think about how they can most effectively invest their resources to target the areas that need the most investment. As part of our financing mechanism, the other provision that we're thinking about is that countries should absolutely be part of the discussion to think about what their own internal priorities should be and where they need the greatest investment to shore up their vulnerabilities. So appreciate the question about targeted financing. I couldn't agree more. And fortunately, we have at our disposal a number of tools that can help make that effective. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, Mr. Chairman, it looks like my time's expired, but I'll just say in closing, if I'm not able to ask this as a further question, that, clearly we need a multilateral financing mechanism like this would need to incentivize efforts to improve transparency and data sharing and support countries in doing that as we prepare for future biosecurity threats, because the kind of idea that South Africa and other countries did such a great job in sharing, and then they seem to be penalized for it. We have to figure out ways to get beyond that. So thanks, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And, I think with that, we've asked all the questions. It doesn't look like the ranking member, Mr. Shabbat, has a closing statement. So I want to, commend, each of the witnesses for your testimony, and look forward to working with the other members on this subcommittee, full committee, and Congress to address some of the issues that were raised, and again, defeat COVID-19, but at the same time, make sure we're prepared for the next pandemic or any other bio threats. So again, thank you for the testimony. It was timely. And with that, I will go ahead and bang the gavel, and the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.